Hello, and welcome to the Reality Podcast. This is a podcast for health professionals built by nurses. Now, generally, we're going to talk about innovation and what's happening in the world of healthcare. And we do all of this through our subscriber feed, which is Bundle of Rays. So just head over to www.bundleofrays.podia.com to find out more. Otherwise, let's sit down, have a glass of wine or a coffee, and see where the conversation's going to take us this week. Hitting the wrong buttons. All right. Hi, everybody. We've got Lance Bailey we're talking to today as our conversation. I'll let Lance introduce himself.
Oh, cool. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and connect and share more. So I'm Lance. I'm the founder and CEO of HealthySimulation.com, which is a free resource website for the global healthcare simulation community. We're getting somewhere between 30 and 35,000 unique visitors a month to the website. We've got obviously social media following and an email newsletter. We just launched a new webinar platform that's starting off as well and looking into to experiment with some courses too. So there's lots of great content there with product demonstrations and conference highlights, virtual conference obviously this year, research highlights and recaps, latest news, job listings, everything that could be really useful for those that are engaging with healthcare simulation day to day. I'm also the founder of SimGhosts, the nonprofit organization 501c3 that's put on over 20 events globally around the world since 2010, which focus on healthcare simulation technology operations. So whether they be clinical educators or technical operators, whatever their background and technology experience is, we help to create resources in terms of hands-on training as well as online materials to support those communities. That'd be my new puppy you hear in the background there. But I'm no longer with the board, just an advisor to the board. So they've got a great team of board directors, international, global, and also, staff folks. So, but I always just kind of want to share that, there's some great work there. And then just briefly, I'll just share background is, was a founding director of the Clinical Simulation Center for the Nevada System of Higher Education. So 2 nursing schools and a medical school there. That's where I kind of got my chops for management with regards to building that program. Was a sim tech for the LA College Community District, EMT firefighter, trained before that. And then, my first career, as I know many of us sidestep into this weird little world, was in film and digital media production. So I went to UC Santa Cruz for my film degree there. And so, that's how you can kind of see all those worlds kind of brilliantly coming together between the audiovisual, the EMS, the firefighting, the experiential learning, simulation operations, management, and then, of course, building these resources where the goal was to try to combine and connect the global community in a new way. So I know that's a mouthful, but man, it's a lot of stuff that's been happening over those years in terms of trying to create new resources for the community.
God in simulation, let's just put it that way. He's paved the way and provide information for people to learn about simulation. So that's it. And he's got a
it's truly a passion, right? And that's where all that energy comes from, is because I really do believe in this technology. I think it's really cool. I think it's really neat technology, and I think it has a lot of benefit to the space. And when I look at it and I compare it to something like aviation simulation, which is fully adopted, fully mandated, fully regulated, bought in and believed in, and I look at healthcare and I just know that that's where we're going to be at some point in the future. And so helping to strive to get us there faster, further, and better is, everything that I want to work towards achieving in a lot of different variety of ways, because it's coming, right? It's just a matter of time.
I wonder about that as well. It's so, it's such an interesting time. And, there's this conversation that, innovation is technology, and realistically as a nurse, if you spend $100,000 on technology, you could just buy another nurse. And sometimes that actually is really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The emphasis on tech versus other things is the debate we're having now, right? Like, what's the best tech adoption? Because there are other avenues outside of tech. But once you start looking at the tech, obviously I'm biased, I'm a VR guy, but things like wearables. I don't know if you've seen the Tesla suits, man. I've been,
Yes.
Holy Jesus. Like, the concept of like biometrics is one thing, but wearing a suit that can move your body, that's like, what? And if that's capable now, like you just said, like in 5 or 10 years down the line, what a simulation lab is going to look like, what the learners are going to be immersed in, I don't think we could predict at the minute about how that technology will take, a teacher's capability to the learner, because it is pretty unpredictable because it's moving so fast.
Right. Well, I can predict this. I don't know when, but certainly in our future, there will be a point. That's could be the distant future, but you will, as a nurse educator, as a nurse learner, or as a healthcare learner in any capacity, you'll be sitting across from a simulated patient, and they will be so real that you cannot even tell that that is a synthetic human being designed for medical education and training. It'll be that level of realism. Now, maybe that's 250 years away, but we're going to get there at some point or another. If you look at how realistic aviation simulators are with regards to being able to be so good that you can learn how to fly in a simulator and be certified before you ever actually enter into a cockpit, that's the level of realism that's expected, right? And I think at some point we will get there. So obviously there's a lot of transition that needs to happen in our space to be able to get there. And I think one important factor with regards to, buying the technology versus buying the person is, even if you buy the technology, you still have to in a sense, invest in the people that are going to support that technology, right? No one has a computer lab in a school and just expects the clinical faculty to be the ones maintaining the IT networks or the various, VMwares or software that's on there. No, they're going to hire or outsource that to the IT department. They're going to come in and manage those pieces of technology. And the same thing needs to really be considered and handled carefully with regards to these programs that are starting in simulation. And it's really important to think that the initial technology investment is just today's fixed cost. But the reality is that if you don't invest in the people and the process for that technology to be utilized effectively, then you're not going to have ROI for the long run. You're not going to be able to demonstrate how you've used those technologies and those investments, because you're just not going to have the support. So I think a lot of, early on, probably a lot of companies said, oh, it's so easy, just push a few buttons here, there, look at that, bing, bang, boom, and you're using sim. And it's like, nah, okay, maybe. But what happens when the microphone doesn't work, right? And you're just about to start a standardized patient engagement. I've been there before. I've been called down from my office in the director's office all the way down to the SP hall. They had 30, 40 people all in line waiting to do this test, and they couldn't get someone to get logged in. I will say that this learner was like, when I get around technology, it just stops breaking. I'm like, well, that's interesting, because when I get around technology, it just starts working. So the second I put my hand on that keyboard, I must have had the magic touch and it started working. But the reality is it could be small or difficult, but we really need to think about the investments we're making as a strategic level, right? And what do we want the outcomes to be, and how can we make the best possible investments to those specific outcomes? And it's not just about like, oh, we got a grant, let's buy a simulator, because then it's just going to sit in the box. It's not really going to come out and be utilized in a really effective and efficient manner. Anyway, I know that's a lot on that particular sub item, but that's what we're doing here.
There's one company that I've crossed paths with. They're called Virti, VIRTI, and they essentially deliver a learning sort of management system for 360 video. And they actually are working on an AI-based patient, exactly what you're saying. So there's companies, the concept of an avatar, like SimX, Health Scholars, all these sort of simulation-based programs. They have avatars. They're good, but they're not proper real life. You don't look at them and think this is a real person. But Tailspin, these other companies that are developing avatars, they're getting better and better, and it feels like they're getting better every month. You know what I mean? Like there's a new update, and then intuitively they've got retinal tracking. As you move around the room, they look at your eyes while they talk to you. So the intuitive body mannerisms and things, they're coming. I feel like they're already here. It just needs improvement. So I think, your original discussion about the future, I think that's a 3 to 5 year projection that companies will be able to provide avatars that give us that. Even a company like Body Swaps, which is a soft skills communication VR program where you sit down opposite an avatar and you talk to them and do communication. Their avatars are good, but they're not lifelike. And if you had that program where you could talk to them and they had that mannerisms, then that would really give you that emotional training around, conflict resolution or how to talk to a vulnerable person. And that's super interesting, because that's really you know, if you're in a sort of a resuscitation type thing, those human factors around communication, interpersonal skills are so valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that two things really stand in mind with that. If you look at the new technologies coming out of PCS, which are already kind of part of what's in the Vera standardized patient VR app, or with the Alex patient simulator, basically what they've done is they've taken the Google kind of AI for conversation-based learning, and they've implemented it directly into the simulation experience, right? So now, as the machine continues to learn and gather conversations from educators and learners over periods of time, it gets better, right? And so you can, set it up to have certain answers for certain questions. But I mean, I sat in Vera with VR and had conversation with the standardized patient, that was virtual patient. And it was going extremely well, right? Now, I'm sure there's certain open-ended questions which would be slightly difficult for an AI computer to understand. So it was more about asking specific questions, but it wasn't just yes and no. There was a lot of dialogue and back and forth that was happening there. And so I think that's one of the only companies that I've seen doing kind of communication-based AI already in the healthcare simulation environment. And I know that there's other groups that are working with various things, but they have a special focus on that. But then if you look outside of the healthcare simulation space, I don't know if you saw Neon at CES this year. I got a chance to check out, a little bit about that. Super realistic. And what they're doing is they're mapping 3D image cameras, I believe, onto an avatar and then connecting it again to an algorithm-based learning process. So you could have, a terminal that looks like a full screen, and walking up to that terminal, then have a conversation with a person that looks and feels like a real human being.
Yeah.
And so, listen, all these technologies are going to go through the roof in the next 20 years, and really kind of not just in healthcare simulation, but in other places too. But I think what's really neat and exciting is that there are a lot of groups just recently, I think due to COVID, and also just because of the new advances in the technologies in the last 3 years, are looking at the medical training space and seeing a huge opportunity, right? We're maybe at 10% market penetration with regards to developed countries of these technologies. And so what we have ahead of us is a massive boom with regards to the opportunity. The cat's out of the bag, Pandora's box is open. We're not going to go back to training on oranges or on each other's arms, right? And so anyone who's at that point right now where they're like, oh, this whole simulation thing, they're a laggard level of adoption technology, mindset with these tech, they're going to retire soon, because anyone who's at that level is probably, towards the end of their career, and they're not interested in kind of experimenting with these technologies. It's going to take a generational shift, I think, and as part of the process of kind of a massive adoption. But in a sense, we really need to think about how these technologies are going to be utilized in the next 10 to 20 years to demonstrate ROI effectively. And I think that that's a really important conversation, because sure, there are going to be fancy and shiny new toys coming out consistently. New companies are going to be entering into the space, but the competitive marketplace will demonstrate who the winners are, because they'll be the ones that can showcase their ROI over time to administrators of the programs that are investing in those technologies. And I think that's where we kind of get the greatest bang for the buck, because really at the end of the day, it comes down to the dollars, right? Especially when you're thinking about hospital executives investing in simulation on the preventative side of things. I think that goes hand in hand with patient safety and the types of conversations that are happening there in terms of those movements. So lots of exciting things are going to be happening in our space for sure.
Yeah. Well, that's essentially what I'm working with some Korean universities at the moment, and what their problem is they can't send students to hospitals because of COVID. So there's a reduction in sort of clinical placement. So I've built them a sequence of training programs. So starting off with 360 video scenarios that they can review over and over again that are embedded with questions. And then there's a VR product. So things like medication administration, how to manage a PICC line dressing, an A to E assessment. So they can practice it, see it in 360 over and over, and then they physically get to do the task in VR, even though they're not going out and clinically doing these things. So like you said earlier, they can't clinically get signed off as competent, but the process learning around those skills is pretty much squared away. So they could walk in and they could, I'm going to post them a Quest 2 headset. They get it, put it on, do it, post it back. They can use it over and over again for a week. And when you compare that to real life training, it's actually pretty close, the concepts and the ideology of aseptic technique and all that. And that's what we're doing now. So I definitely foresee that is going to be an interesting thing. But
Yeah. I mean, the research just fully supports the neurological development of using VR in terms of in place. And I mean, for those listeners that have not put on a VR headset yet, I would say just wait till the Oculus 2, is available. Get that one and put that one on your head and experience what it's like to be in basically your own personal holodeck. I mean, you can be on the surface of Mars playing a video game, a laser tag, and then you can be doing a surgical intervention with 3 or 4 other team members literally 10 minutes later, right? And so the dynamic range of the tool, it enables for a quick access utilization. I mean, we're talking about a Oculus Quest and the Quest 2. There's no cables, there's no cords. It's all within the system that's on your head, right? And so I think the ease of use is going to continue to increase. The price is going to maintain about the same, but the technology is going to continue to get better. The graphics, the capabilities, the communicative knowledge, and I think that folks need to put that on and experience and understand a little bit about what that feels like. But just to go back to your other earlier point there, I think that when we look at aviation simulation, it's fully kind of already adopted in simulation. And so in a sense, what you have is a tier of learning that is siloed to an individual moment in that learner's career, right? Whether they're in school or through their educational process or in the training process and recertification process for their professional component of their career. And so, you start off with a book and a lecture, but then you move to a laptop, desktop screen that just has instrument controls, right? You're just seeing elevation go up and pitch and those kind of things. You don't even have any visual representation yet of what the outside world looks like around you. And then maybe you move up to a simulator that has more of a joystick and has more visual kind of at a computer before you even get anywhere near a high fidelity simulator with hydraulics and then of course real life flying, right? And so I think what we're seeing here is that these new technology opportunities within healthcare education and training, there's going to be a lot of new kind of bridge layers to the hierarchy of kind of this training that goes all the way up to realistic training or actual professional kind of education as you're in the job, doing the job itself, right? Because we're never not learning in healthcare. There's always something that we're going to learn every single day that we're there. But on the way up there from the classroom book all the way up, there's going to be different levels. And I think technologies like VR and AR and telesimulation, they're going to be starting to add these new layers that we never even had as an availability to us. And right. And so we can learn the skill in a book. We can see one demonstrated on a patient through a video library that we have access to. We can put on a VR headset. We can experience what that feels like. Then we can use a low fidelity task trainer to provide that particular aspect of the skill. And then we can move on to a high fidelity environment. And then of course the patient care itself, right? So I think there's these new layers that are going to be coming and adding into the space. And I think it's going to create for a much more dynamic process, start to finish, for education and training.
Yeah, it's, like I said earlier, it's really interesting about, making sure we have the counter arguments, because as a barrier, train the trainer. So I've been implementing VR with a few different providers here. And obviously there's an on-ramp, which is what you're talking about before about, yes, executives could buy technology, but actually the person who's in the room teaching needs to be all over that. And without that, then you're not going to have the proper adoption and ROI, et cetera. But it's more of that interesting, wider organizational needs, but then finding these little crux, the niche barriers that we can overcome. And I still feel like we're probably there at the moment. And that's where we need to be vocal about, all right, this is a barrier. Obviously COVID infection control, that's something that pops up, but it's providing that education for the barriers to say, yes, just like simulation has done for the last 10 years. And essentially that means that we need to publish research. So advocating people that here's new technology, whether it's tele-simulation or VR, it doesn't have to all be VR based, but whatever don't rush it, here it is, let's put it in, let's do a pilot, let's do some research and bang it out. Rather than, spend 50,000 on something that gathers dust and, the teachers don't really gel with. That's the interesting part. So, Yeah, as a provider, I'm really mindful of that, is that, you can bang the chain and ring the bell to say, "Doot, doot, 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 I'm saving the industry, here's something new." But the reality is, of course, it's going to come with disadvantages, and we probably have to speak to those, because you put a headset on and it's obvious, right? You go, wow, this is cool. Right. But it's getting past that wow factor. And the really interesting thing is that, are you going to train someone in a VR headset for 5 years? Are they going to want to wear a headset for a long amount of time over, that period? So if you've got someone a new graduate nurse comes into the industry, you start training with VR, are they still going to want to wear a headset 18 months down the line to keep learning their skills? That's a really interesting part of it. Maybe they want the variety and actually have the headset off, like what amount of time is the right amount of time for skill attainment. And, you could do one or two skills, but do they really want to wear it for hours at a time?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can't wear a headset for hours at a time because
Exactly.
I can't look at a phone and while driving in a car, I get motion sickness, right? So I have certain limitations there that will just prevent me from going, to Vader level 4 in one go, because it's just, I can only swing the lightsaber so much. Or Arena VR is a great example of that. You're floating around in a 0G space and you're trying to throw a Frisbee when you can kind of do flips and turn around. And it's fantastic, but it gets a little overwhelming after your third kind of flip around upside down in 3D space, And so, I think that what's important, I agree with you. What's important is that research and kind of understanding, like, how can VR best be utilized as a tool in the toolbox, right? And I think low fidelity task training, mid fidelity kind of ward stuff, and high fidelity and IPE environments, all those things need to be kind of tested out to better understand. The research needs to continue to better understand at what percentage. And of course, the national landmark study put on by the National Council for State Boards of Nursing in the United States, the landmark study that came out a few years ago, said up to 50% of simulation of clinical hours for rotation for training for nurse students could be replaced by simulation with no adverse effects, which means it was equal to the same level of quality that was being given in clinical rotations. Well, that frees up a lot of opportunity. And that was the max that they studied. So they didn't even go beyond that. I think they did 20, 30, and 50 in terms of various cohorts for variables out testing which one. And it was up to 50 was like no change, right? So that demonstrates to me that the technology is becoming more realistic and people are better understanding how to implement and utilize it. And so in that sense, we could have a time and a place where 75%. Does that replace clinical patient work? No, right? Like, we still need those things. You still need to get into an airplane and fly it to know what it feels like to lose cabin pressure or to have an engine failure at 30,000 feet. Like, you're still going to need some of that kind of process, and that's an important part of it. But how can we keep adding more layers between the textbook and the actual patient engagement that enable for, also not just a better performance outcome, but better care providers in terms of stress, right? In terms of the challenges that they're faced as learners and as professionals. There's a lot of stress with regards to being a healthcare provider. And I think these technologies can better orient people to the position in terms of the realities of what it's like to work in healthcare, and also mitigate some of those pressures with regards to the high burnout rate that we have in healthcare, right? I think that these new technologies can further not only help for education and training, patient safety, but also just healthcare provider, quality of life, quality of career. I think these technologies will help there as well.
That's a rabbit hole that I've gone down recently. So rather than thinking about it as training, I've been thinking about it as performance. So if you are Djokovic, you play in the pro tennis circuit, you train, you perform, but you also rest. There's this period of that rest is just as important as your training. And we don't do that, right? So then you start to, wellness gets thrown around. Don't get me wrong. We have pictures of our dogs in our change room and it makes us happy. And, I'm all up for wellness. I've worked in 2 wars and, I get, but I think we need to think about wellness a little bit differently, is that we think about performance, is that, yes, we need our rest. We need to have downtime. So, concepts like meditation, yoga, finding it's such an individual thing that's when we look at a team, like if you're looking at a high performing team, like an emergency team in a resus department, we really need to think about performance. So you can map people's competencies easily, but can you map their rest? Can you map the way that they have their downtime? And we don't capture that as an analytic in terms of, okay, here comes an ED physician who's going to do a thoracotomy, right? But how much sleep has he had? How well
Right.
he, and
Yeah.
medical error perspective, that shit matters, man.
Right. Yeah.
I it's an interesting thing because we talk about high performing teams, and if you're going to have pretty interventional surgical processes that are in an emergency scenario, people need to know what to do and they need to know when they're going to do it. So you take that from a tertiary hospital that might perform that once a month, or whatever. And then you put it in like a regional area where there's an MVA and they just roll in the door. How do you prepare those people to be shit hot on the spot, and to replicate their training on a regular basis? So the organization saves money, but obviously that the outcomes that they can transmit are good for the patients.
Yeah. And I think, two things on that, just speaking of wellness, again, to point to aviation, just because I think it's a brilliant industry to compare ourselves to. When you have a 747 flight, international flight from LA to Australia, you'll have 4 pilots on that flight. The commanding pilot and co-pilot will take off the plane. And after they get out of the airspace and at maximum elevation, they'll turn the plane over to the other 2 pilots. Those pilots will fly the plane for the majority of the actual overseas flight. And then once we get close to a landing time, the original pilots will come back and they will land the plane, right? And so that is just specifically due to research that's proven that certain number of hours, after a certain number of hours, pilots should be given rest to operate properly, right? We don't have any of that in healthcare. Like, I remember my parents telling me stories of my dad working 3, 4, 5 days straight in the emergency department. It's just like, how is he useful? Now, of course, he was, had a bed. He said he had a bed somewhere that he would sleep, and then they would come and wake him up at 4 a.m. for whatever the next patient was. But it's just like, that is not an efficient use of a human being's wellness time, right? They're not going to create those outcomes that you want in a consistent and qualitative manner, because we're trying to squeeze every last ounce of blood out of that stone. And I think that translates into simulation in our discussion here. And that, like, I've heard from Dr. Barry Eisenberg, one fantastic presentation that he gave at ASPE in the UK a couple years back. And he was talking about how they had utilized the iSim course and done some really great work with regards to some education and training. They've done this course hundreds of times, to participants from all over the world. And I believe it was Korea that a cohort was not getting the same outcomes that they were trying to replicate. And I've heard a similar story from Damien, who I think works with Harvard now at CMS, who had done, I think it was him, excuse me if I'm wrong, but where they had created a pilot program of simulation. I believe it was for resuscitation. It was for some clinical outcomes. I'm sorry, it was a long time ago. But he tried to then replicate that across multiple hospitals within the system. Didn't get the same results. Same thing, back to Dr. Eisenberg's story. The Korean group was not getting the same results. And they had to do kind of like, well, what's going on here? And they did a process evaluation. Well, it turns out that in the Korean culture, the training is reserved to do at the end of 2 days of rotation. So now, after 2 days of being a resident, now it's like, okay, now we're going to load up the simulator and go for it. It's just like, well, wait a minute. Like, how does that provide for the time and the energy necessary? And then to the story reflecting in New York, when it happened, when I believe it was with Damien, it was suggesting that, well, they had champions that were building that program and really watching for the results and making sure that instructors or those that were operating and overseeing these programs adhered to strict standards and policy. Whereas when that program went more regional, it fell apart because they didn't have the same kind of enforcement with regards to what they were trying to do. And so point being there is just that, again, the technology is a brilliant, shiny car, but who's going to put the gas in it? Who's going to pay for the maintenance? And how are we going to make sure that we keep that thing running properly around the racetrack every single day? Because if we slip and we just swap out one driver for another, and that person only has 1/10 of the amount of experience, well, that car is going to crash, right? And so I think it's important to really think about this as a process. And I think that stems from us looking at patient safety initiatives, the ridiculous level of medical errors that are taking place in all over the world. In the United States, the 3rd leading cause of death outside of a COVID year. That's obviously going to be change those statistics for the year and in years to come. But I think that learning from and looking at what we're trying to accomplish, identifying stakeholders and their specific needs, and going after low-hanging fruit, right? Like, what are the things that your institution, whether it be educational or professional, that could utilize and show a case for simulation improving those particular outcomes, and then using that and making sure that you kind of create a successful program, learn about processes, learn about the technologies, learn about implementation and record keeping and data tracking and research and implementation and outcomes, see those outcomes and use that to leverage to bigger projects, right? And so I think scaling simulation, it's much easier to do when we start to respect the amount of work that it's really going to take to be successful, starting small and growing from there. Just kind of like a small business, right? You can't become Google overnight. You need time to get to that place, right? You need to build stepping points along the way.
You don't need to tell me that shit, I'll tell you.
Yeah, as a business owner, I say overnight success takes 10 years. So
I'm 2 years in, Lance. Help me out here, man.
Yeah. Good luck.
Feeling the pain. All right. That's awesome, man. Well, we've covered a lot of good stuff there. I won't take up too much of your time. So if anyone hasn't checked out Healthy Simulation, you've got to go online, go and have a look. A massive resource for simulation, and obviously get involved with SimGhosts as well. They do some great conferences and different events. So, all right, man, you go give your dog a pat. Take care of the pup. Thanks for taking the time to chat. It's been awesome.
Anytime. Yeah. I love what you're doing and all the VR resources that you're creating. And so, I'll make sure to share this with our group and let them know about the things that you're accomplishing. And of course, if anyone has any questions or needs, they can always email me, lance@healthysimulation.com, and do my best to help them out.
Take it easy, man. I'll talk to you soon.
Cheers. Thanks, buddy.
Ciao. Well, that's it for another week. We hope you enjoyed our podcast. If you're enjoying the content and what you see here at Bundle of Rays and through the Reality Podcast, just head over to our subscriber feed, which is www.bundleofrays.podia.com, and we can continue to chat over there. But for now, you stay safe and just keep going. Cheers.